Hello and welcome. I'm Jason Poole, Director of Product Marketing for Application Security at Citrix. It's my job to keep my teams and their accounts abreast of what's happening in the application security industry and ensure Citrix products can help our customers mitigate the new threats that the continually evolving cyber threat landscape brings. OWASP recently updated its top 10 list of the most critical threats to web applications. It's a pretty big shake-up that will likely, in fact should, have a big impact on the way your business addresses its application security going forward. As I said, the latest OWASP Top 10 list represents the most radical shake-up since the original list was published in 2003. The reason for the dramatic changes are related to the rapidly evolving cyber landscape, which, as we know, is having a dramatic impact on businesses today. Many customers I speak with feel that they aren't yet ready to address these security changes and are starting to re-examine security structure based on the latest threats and the latest guidance from OWASP. This presentation, which should last 30 to 40 minutes, will look at some of the more major changes from the 2017 list to the latest list and examine their impact and what it means for your business. And while Citrix is an active player in the arena of application security, and yes, we can help you protect your apps from the latest attacks, today's talk is not a product pitch. I want to give you some guidance on the changes, and at the end, I'll invite you to engage further for how we can help you mitigate these latest issues. More specifically, we'll discuss OWASP's new research methodology and what it means for providing better insight into current and future threats which you need to mitigate. We'll look at the new vulnerability categories that they've added and how they sort of tacitly recognize that for us to improve security, we have to start thinking about it earlier in the application lifecycle. There's been a few renaming and rescoping. We'll talk about that and how these ranking changes that we'll see reflect the dynamics of the security industry, the areas where we've made progress and where we really need to get a little better. And in each case, I'll try to focus on not just what's changed, but what it means for your business and the impact on your approach to application security. But first, let me set the scene about OWASP and why so many companies look to them for guidance on application security. The Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, was founded as a non-profit foundation, to raise awareness about application security, and over the years it's become the de facto gold standard for AppSec. They have tens of thousands of members across the globe, many of whom undertake extensive and valuable research into application security. And while OWASP have created many educational tools and produces many different cheat sheets aimed at security professionals, they're most known for their list of top 10 most critical and severe web application security risks. As we said, these lists get updated periodically to reflect the changing threat landscapes. And many businesses and application security vendors alike turn to them when they need guidance on the most pointed application vulnerabilities. And indeed, the list tends to serve as a checkpoint for AppSec and are the first thing security professionals try to combat when protecting their apps and API assets. If you're in AppSec, you should probably look towards the OWASP Foundation for a little bit of help for now and then. So what are these big changes? What's all the noise about? Well, at a high level, there are 4 areas that have changed. The first area of change is that OWASP used a new research methodology to derive this list. And 2021 saw a much more data-driven approach, to their analysis, which makes the results better able to reflect the current threats, and they augmented this with expert opinion, which provides clearer insight into future threats. The new report sees 3 new categories added to the list, 2 of which absolutely recognize the need to address security earlier in the application cycle. There was a renaming and a rescoping of several categories to better reflect the causes of the security issues rather than the symptoms. And this is something that will offer businesses a more prescriptive idea of what they need to fix. And of course, there were lots of changes to the individual rankings, as you'd expect. And while there are minor changes in every report, there were some major shifts in 2021, all of which reflect the changing nature of the threat landscape that businesses face. And we'll go through each of these areas and look at the impacts to your application security approach. Of course, as this is a webinar, we'll have to stay quite general. We can't get into the subtle nuances of your particular environment, but I'd love to invite you to reach out to your Citrix reps who will gladly organize a workshop to see how we can help you more specifically. And so let's take a quick look and see how 2017 on the left compares to 2021. You can see there are a lot of changes to the rankings. The light colored categories on the list moved down, and the darker colored items moved up in the rankings. You'll see 3 new categories on the right: insecure design, software and data integrity failures, and server-side request forgery. And we'll look at each of these. Several things were renamed and rescoped: cryptographic failures, vulnerable and outdated components, it's changed its name, identification and authentication failures was broken off, security logging and monitoring failures, all of these have changed their names. And when you add the shifts in for this, green for good going down, red for bad going up, you see that it represents a very radical shake-up, the biggest in the history of the OWASP top 10 list. Now this looks complex, and it can be. Let's see if we can't simplify it and start looking at what the major changes made. And we'll start with the new research methodology. Now I mentioned that, in my opinion, this has a real impact on the outcome of the list in general. In the past, OWASP used to survey its members for feedback about threats and would include a list of what it thought were the major things and ask for comments. And while there was always included a section for more open feedback, OWASP felt that that format led to a disproportionate focus on the listed items and that they thought would skew the results. It's like trying to find your favorite color by giving you a list of 10 to choose from, and while you might take the time to input an unlisted option, say Vermilion, when it's something as subjective as a personal favorite, when presented with a list, it's easy to just order what's there and not to add to it. 2021, however, OWASP asked organizations to provide raw data on the prevalence of all the vulnerabilities they saw in their tests and used this to create the new list. This led to 1.5 or more than 1.5 million data points being reported. And OWASP painfully and dutifully analyzed this data, ranked it, and importantly, they did not just look at the prevalence, but also factored in the potential impact of the threats before compiling their final list of most critical vulnerabilities. And while this makes the 2021 top 10 list more data-driven than ever before, OWASP actually quite cleverly suggested that this entirely data-driven approach is like a window on the past that only captured vulnerabilities that are known and could be tested. Think about it. If there's an emerging threat that's not routinely tested for, or even if it is, it might not be prevalent today, but might be something to watch for tomorrow. Therefore, they augmented these results with a community survey which asked security experts what they see as weaknesses that the data does not show yet. In this way, they were able to compile a more reliable list that captures both the current threat landscape and offers insight into future threats, which is like manna from heaven for security professionals looking to safeguard their applications today and going forward. And probably the most significant conclusion from their research, the one that prompts or should prompt the biggest change in a business's approach to application security, is the overwhelming indication that you need to start designing security into your applications earlier in their life cycle. And while this philosophy should be and has been a mainstay of security professionals and ought to be obvious, it's something that businesses have ignored for a long time. The media is full of companies who've paid the price with vulnerable apps going into production and had to face higher costs to protect them or correct them post-production. No, it is a sound strategy backed up by OWASP data that the earlier you start thinking about security, the more secure your applications can become. It takes a little more effort, but it is definitely worth it. And for the first time, OWASP has really recognized this and introduced 2 new categories that put more focus on shifting or expanding to the left. Insecure design, at number 4, is without a doubt the biggest ticket item on the OWASP top 10 list and will cut across all the other elements. It represents a bold move by OWASP and its members who've traditionally put more focus on application security post-production. OWASP is suggesting that if security is to see major improvements, we need to expand left, not just in application coding, but also in the planning and design phases as well. After all, poor design cannot be fixed by perfect implementation. And this is a tacit admission that you can't rely on post-production security alone to protect your assets. It seems that many application vulnerabilities creep into software because secure design principles are not followed from the outset. For example, all too often, application error messages offer up sensitive information about the application environment. Stored credentials are not protected, and the reliance on answering personal questions is not a secure design for authentication recovery. Businesses need to expand to the left and get smarter about designing security into their applications earlier and aligning application development with business security requirements. OWASP suggests that you should work with application security professionals to identify your areas of weakness and then establish software design principles that tackle them. Build off of tried and tested secure design patterns and components. You should also employ threat modeling for authentication, access control, and business logic flows, and test everything along the way. Now, the obvious benefit to improving the design process is that it will minimize other issues down the road in exactly the areas that are so problematic in the top 10 list. No, you have to address secure design before you even start considering your SAST, your DAST, your WAF, and all these things and how you're going to protect it. You have to get the design right. That's imperative. Another new critical category on the list for 2021 is software and data integrity. This highlights the issues related to using code and infrastructure that does not sufficiently protect against integrity violations. For example, the use of compromised plugins, libraries, or modules from sources that have not been checked or verified. Think Log4j. This is something that can leave a gaping hole despite all your other preventative measures. Interestingly, OWASP cite the CI/CD approach to application development as a major contributor to the use of plugins, libraries, and softwares of dubious integrity. The rush for speed, it seems, often leads to the use of unvalidated code or components, which can leave the door open for associated unauthorized access, malicious code injection, or system compromise. Similarly, the problem is being exacerbated as more apps now update automatically and may not include sufficient validation. The OWASP data show this problem is getting worse and needs to be addressed quickly. As a business, you need to ensure that your software and even the libraries you use within it is from a trusted repository and is secure. The use of digital signatures can help here, of course, and as can a review process for your own code to ensure that malicious elements have not been implanted. Further, OWASP highly recommend using a software supply chain security tool to check all your components for known vulnerabilities. So while following all the best practices in the world may not absolutely guarantee protection, it will minimize the chances of unwittingly introducing vulnerabilities into your software. You only have to look at the SolarWinds incident to gauge the potential scale of an unvalidated or compromised software updates. The third new category introduced in the latest OWASP Top 10 is a server-side request forgery. SSRF is viewed as a massive threat by the security community and something that experts agree can have a potentially severe impact on a business. It was the number one concern among the security professionals surveyed, not because of its prevalence, but more because of the severity of its impact. You only need to look at the Capital One attack of 2019, where attackers liberated credit card data from 106 million users from an AWS S3 bucket, or the way that SSRF was used by the Hafnium Group to infiltrate 250,000 Microsoft Exchange servers and create trouble by stealing credentials and installing ransomware to get an idea of the potential harm that SSRF can have on a business. Server-side request forgery vulnerabilities let an attacker send crafted requests from a vulnerable application to the back-end server resources. Thus, even though a resource may be protected from outside access, the request appears to come from a trusted source, the internal application server, and the data is freely given and relayed to the attacker. As I said earlier, although SSRF attacks show a relatively low incidence rate, OWASP is included in the top 10 based on their survey results, which indicate their members' concern. It was, as I said, the #1 fear for security professionals surveyed. However, it may be that these fears are overblown because it was a big topic during the survey period. That said, the potential for data breaches via SSRF is extreme, and the impact can be severe, as we mentioned previously. OWASP viewed this threat so worryingly that it was the only included category that housed a single attack. Potential issues include massive exposure of sensitive data. Because the request appears to come from a trusted source, it has the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. The compromise of internal services. An attacker may get to internal services to conduct further attacks, such as remote code execution or denial of service. And resource scanning and mapping, of course. Attackers can potentially map out your entire internal network and scan for other vulnerabilities that can be exploited, leading to untold issues. Now, SSRF acts as a Trojan horse into your internal environment, such that no back-end resources can be considered safe. And OWASP and its members predict that SSRF will increase as modern web applications promote convenience and make more calls to external data on behalf of users. It's likely that SSRF will climb higher in future lists, but perhaps by putting it on the table now, businesses will be inspired to be proactive and mitigate SSRF and reduce its impact. And while on the topic of mitigation, an obvious step would be to minimize the type, scope, and the number of requests an application can make. However, in the modern era of applications, they need to talk to each other, so this might be unfeasible, and you need to look at other mitigation techniques that provide protection at the network and the application layer. You need to use a firewall to restrict host communications and enforce deny by default. You need perhaps whitelist permitted communications either by DNS or IP address, and make sure that you prevent all but essential requests. Enable authentication between hosts. Consider making this standard practice for all internal host communications. And of course, log all flows for monitoring and auditing. Understand which hosts need to communicate, why, and when. And extend this positive security model to the application layer with well-defined and enforced URL schema, ports and destination allow lists, and disable HTTP redirection on your applications. Further, you must ensure that all client-side data, input data, is sanitized and validated either in the application itself or with a WAF. Similarly, check that all responses conform to expectations. Never send raw data to a client. You do not want to inadvertently have your entire subscriber database issued into the wild. And who knows what the future holds, but it's likely that SSRF will climb higher over time as applications make more internal calls and architectures increase in complexity. The hope, I suppose, as I said, is that by putting it on the list now, businesses will proactively mitigate it and reduce its impact overall. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's been a real shake-up in the rankings of the categories, and with some vulnerabilities become less of a threat and others increasing. I won't cover them all here, but there were 3 headline changes that really stood out for me. Let's start with the good news. Identification and authentication failures have shown big improvements in the last 4 years. This category has dropped from number 2 on the list to number 7. And this is a big win for the application security industry. OWASP suggests that this is probably because of the increased availability of standardized authentication frameworks and their adoption by business. That said, authentication remains a big challenge for business. It is still in the top 10 after all, and data showed that 2.5% of all apps tested still have authentication weaknesses of some kind. Organizations need to continue to take authentication and identity seriously. Access control, on the other hand, I suppose the corollary to the improvements in ID and authentication has been that access control is seemingly more broken than before, taking the top spot on the top 10 list for the first time. OWASP reported that of the tested applications, 3.8% had one or more authorization flaws. Indeed, there were a staggering 381,000 occurrences of broken access control vulnerabilities in their dataset. It seems that while business is getting better at determining who is accessing apps, it's failing to ensure that users, processes, and devices can do only what they're supposed to do. And the third change is that injection weaknesses have lost their unwelcome crown as the most critical web app security risk. Injection had occupied the top spot since 2010, but in the latest list, injection, which includes now cross-site scripting, has dropped to number 3. But let's not get overexcited. These attacks have not gone away, and they're still a very real threat to businesses that need to be mitigated. Now is not the time to take your eye off injection attacks. So what does this mean for your application security? It means that you have to continue to act against the old guard of threats that we know well. The fight's not over, and you have to ensure that you have proper mitigation measures in place. Identity and authentication may have improved, but we cannot let up. After all, if someone can bypass or fool the authentication system, then they have the ability to do an awful lot of damage. We have to ensure where we use passwords that users practice excellent password hygiene. Ensure that passwords are long, strong, and changed frequently. And better still, you should implement multi-factor authentication wherever possible to prevent credential stuffing and brute force attacks. And now might be the time to look at more modern authentication mechanisms anyway, certificates, tokens, biometrics, and integrate that with your authorization. Access control is critical and so frequently overlooked. All too often, authentication is put in place with no controls over the action a user or device can carry out. The focus of being OWASP's most critical application security issue should bring broken access control into your security crosshairs and spur action to be taken. A good first step is to think about what each user and device actually needs to do. Carefully define the right policies and implement control mechanisms for each application. Does everyone need to be able to modify, or is read enough? Maintain the least privilege principle and give no more rights than is strictly necessary. Deny everything by default and enforce it. And when access control failures occur, log them. Persistent failures could indicate an attack, and you should alert admins immediately, as well as blocking the offending account. And when you do grant access, use a short lifespan on any session tokens used. This will minimize the window of opportunity an attacker has to compromise your applications. When a session is over, do not allow any tokens to be reused. Invalidate them immediately. Also, to mitigate the effect of automated threats, you should rate limit API access. An injection, while these defenses are improving, we have to remain vigilant. It is still a top 3 vulnerability threat after all. If you fall victim to an injection attack that exposes your sensitive data, then it can be very costly to clean up, especially when you consider any compensation and legal penalties that you might incur. So what should you do to mitigate these attacks? Adopt a positive security model that restricts users and devices, which users and devices can run commands against sensitive data. At a minimum, you should employ server-side validation of commands and tightly control the use of SQL commands, with inquiries to prevent mass disclosure of records in the case of a SQL injection attack. But sometimes it's not doing the basics right that leads to disaster, and nowhere is this more crucial than with security. Leaving a super secure door open or writing down a complex password is an invitation for compromise. Frequently, it's exactly the type of opportunistic attack that can cause the most damage. Getting the simple things right can mitigate a lot of issues. The latest OWASP Top 10 brought home this message with 2 categories that continue to lead to security breaches, but that should be simple to fix. Sitting at number 2 on the list, previously called sensitive data exposure, OWASP renamed it to cryptographic failures to call out the main cause of the issue, namely a lack of or poorly implemented encryption techniques. Exposing sensitive data can have a devastating impact on a business and lead to loss of customer confidence, reputation damage, and of course legal exposure. Of the numerous vulnerabilities in this category, OWASP cite the use of hard-coded passwords and the use of broken or risky crypto algorithms as two of the most notable causes of cryptographic failure issues. It seems that, unbelievably, some organizations still use cryptographic algorithms that are proven to be risky to protect their data at rest and in transit. In the modern world, this will lead to a data breach. Numerous techniques exist and are documented to break these weaker algorithms, and you can rest assured that attackers know them and will use them. You have to enforce encryption for all data at rest and in transit by default. Make sure to use strong encryption, modern SSL algorithms, protocols, and keys. Further, best practice dictates that the use of authenticated encryption to ensure both confidentiality and authenticity of the data. It can be a full-time job to research and implement the latest SSL standards, and it can be prone to errors. So it's important to verify the effectiveness of settings. For example, insist on the strongest SSL mechanisms and check your configuration using the Qualys SSL Labs A+ certification tool. Similarly, it should go without saying that the use of vulnerable and outdated components is an application security risk. Indeed, this category, renamed in the latest top 10 list to reflect the cause rather than the symptom, has moved up from number 9 to number 6, based on the data and the number of flaws reported. Interestingly, when OWASP asked the opinion of security professionals directly, they put this category as the second biggest threat, which indicates that this is viewed as an even more serious problem among security professionals. They know it's difficult to track all the versions of the components in use and stay abreast of which are vulnerable, unsupported, or out of date. And this includes operating system, web and application servers, and databases as well. And while this is a problem that will never go away, it can be mitigated. Obviously, businesses need not be told to only use official sources and versions for components, and ensure that software is always signed to prevent modified and malicious components. Although, bear in mind, this is no guarantee. SolarWinds. And yes, businesses have to do a better job to continuously inventory their components in their environment and check for disclosed vulnerabilities and new CVEs. And while there are a lot of tools out there to help with this, for example the OWASP dependency check, there may be a need for manual checks as well. It's important to establish an application lifecycle plan to help monitor, apply updates, and check configs regularly so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Let's face it, if you know something's vulnerable, then you can guarantee the hacking community knows it as well. So we've covered some of the headline changes and looked not just at what's changed, but explored the potential implications for your application security. I hope that it's given you some food for thought. OWASP is really the North Star when it comes to application security, and they know what they're talking about. And they're telling us that to secure our apps, we have to do it earlier. We can't rely on post-production security alone. We have to shift to the left. They're also showing us that the threat landscape is changing and we need to mitigate the modern threats like SSRF. Their top 10 list also reminds us that there are still many basic things that can be improved that will yield immediate results. And while nothing is ever 100% secure, you can help yourself by considering the following questions. How rigorous is your software security design? How can you be sure? And what tests are you doing to prove that? Does your software components, do they leave you exposed? And there are a lot of libraries, modules, and other pieces in your modern applications. How do you know they're secure? What testing are you doing? And how will you mitigate against more sophisticated threats as we go forward? What about SSRF? Is your network segmented? Do you enforce authentication, authorization for all communications? Do you validate client-supplied input data? How? And what about responses? How are you looking at those to ensure that your data doesn't disappear onto the internet? Are you prioritizing application authentication and access control? Do all your users need the access they have? Do you implement deny by default? And are you doing this for users and APIs both? Well, Citrix has been at the forefront of web application security for 2 decades now. The Citrix ADC integrates web application security, including WAF, bot management, and API protection, all built in. It's time to examine the benefits of consolidating app security with Citrix. You may already have an entitlement that you aren't even aware of. Let Citrix help you explore this. Reach out to your local rep and arrange a workshop to discuss how Citrix can help you ensure your apps are protected. And with that, I thank you very much. This presentation has looked at some of the major changes in the OWASP Top 10 list. The new list represents a major revamp over 2017, possibly the most dramatic since its inception. And that said, if we use the OWASP Top 10 as a guide for application security, it may mean more work for the security teams, but the results will be better protection for your business's applications. Thank you.